Thank you for being here, first of all. I do want to show a couple of things. One of the most common questions that I do get is, what is encaustic? And encaustic, most people are familiar with beeswax. Same beeswax that comes from candles. You see it in the granule form, you see it in the block form, but a lot of people don't know what damar resin is. And all of the encaustic paintings that you see, a true encaustic is made with damar resin and beeswax, and they're actually melted together. And damar resin is really fun because it's actually a tree sap, and my son is 9. He's very into Jurassic Park. So you can literally find sometimes insects and tree bits in the damar resin, and we totally pretend we're Jurassic Park if we do find something exciting. So damar resin and beeswax together is what creates encaustic medium. And you can pass these around. I'll leave these here. Encaustic medium, I also have right here. If you can envision, it's almost like a griddle that I have everything melted in. And when I paint it on, I'm working with a hot to cool. So imagine if you spilled candle wax on something. It's gonna have a little bit of a mounded texture, but what happens is I use a brush to apply these layers of beeswax, starting with clear encaustic medium, probably about 4 layers. And some of you, it's exciting because some of you might know exactly what this stuff is, now that I'm seeing it go around. But anyway, about 4 to 5 layers of the encaustic medium, and then I use my heat torch. You can use a torch, you can use a heat gun, and that's what this layer is here. It's actually called fused as soon as you add heat. So on the way bottom, I often use oil paint within my encaustics. I almost treat it just like an oil painting. I'll put it flat, fuse, and I'll stick it up on my easel to start painting with the oil paints. And there is a little bit of an interesting ratio that you have to stay in between with oil paints and encaustic, but it's a lot of fun to experiment with both. So oil paints, and then there's also encaustic paint, which is simply this with pigments added to that medium. So I'll go ahead and pass these around. I don't need to show you. These, I know, and it's fun. So that's one of the things, I would never say that, on an opening night, I would never say, hey, yeah, go touch the paintings. You can kind of do that with encaustic. It predates oil paint. It has been here forever. And it's a pretty incredible medium. It's a lot more durable. It is just like all other fine art. It's not gonna melt unless your house is on fire. I mean, in that case, you're not gonna want to be in there either. So good to see you, I'm sorry. But you're not gonna wanna be in there either. So this is actually, I was just talking to Joy about this. I teach classes here once a month, and I wanted to grab one of my little demo pieces because you can see kind of a conglomerate. This is where I add all the tests. You can kind of see a conglomerate of what you can do with encaustic. And I'm a very tactile person. When I go places, I need to touch things. Hopefully some of you are like that too. That's why I brought these. So you're more than welcome to take a look at these. There are different effects that you can get with encaustic here. So with that being said, I can't stay still between working with oil paints and encaustic. I do tend to toggle back and forth, but that's a lot to do with my personality. I'm kind of all over the place, and I appreciate it because if I'm having a tough day with encaustics, then I can pause that medium, move over to oil, and experiment with that. So they both kind of develop a passion. I've become very passionate about both of them. And I think encaustic even pushed my love for oil painting even more, to be honest with you. So with the pieces that you see, you can usually kind of tell the one on the far end over here, Rain Veil, that one is oil. This one is oil. And this one is oil. All the others are encaustic. But it's interesting because they were treated the same. Placed flat to fuse with my torch, because as you can imagine, the wax is melting. You're not going to want that to be in a vertical position. And then I place it on my easel to add the oil paints. I'm originally from Michigan. A lot of times you'll see water influences with a lot of my work. It's kind of, you know, and talking about this piece, for example, in Michigan, we don't have big skies. Colorado, we do. I like to almost create a hybrid between the two, because it is, you are so, I mean, people literally get claustrophobic in Michigan. There are trees everywhere, and you can't see much sky. So I tend to create paintings that kind of have a little bit of a balance from each. And I was talking to someone during our opening saying, you know, I like to capture these almost snapshots in time. And that's exactly what these are. I mean, this was a storm off of Highway 9 near Breckenridge. And the water is from my home lake of Lake St. Clair. Most people don't know where Lake St. Clair is. Rainvale, for instance, I see these clouds and they've created this snapshot in my mind that I can't unsee, you could say. But it's so interesting to start to experiment and see if you're able to get that moment from your mind onto a canvas or panel. So a lot of times you will see the big sky, you'll see horizon lines, you'll see hints of water, but those, again, just kind of come from my influence of where I grew up. And granted, I've been here for almost 20 years. And when I moved here, I did not stop. I mean, I traveled this state. I wanted to see every corner. And if you're a Michigander, it's kind of weird. There is a connection between Colorado and Michigan. I don't know what it is. I don't know if you, but my dad loved Colorado and he would tell me stories about Colorado, and we were always a very outdoors family. So I knew it was someplace, and it very well may have just been that. It may have been him, my father. But I always kind of established this, I must go to this location, I must be in this place, I need to be in this space, because he was a big inspiration in my life. So, but there is this weird connection between those two states. So my windows idea, and I feel usually that you can't truly see something unless you have contrast, and I'll kind of touch on that in a second here. But my windows concept, this might be kind of interesting, but I remember we grew up on a farm in Michigan, and I had this huge tree in our backyard, and we had tornadoes. Not too much different weather than we had today, but we had tornadoes in Michigan. We had one come through our backyard, and it only took one tree out, but it was like my favorite tree. And it was the tree that I could see right outside my window, and I would constantly look at the negative space and the shapes that this tree could make. And I don't know, my family was going through a lot of tough times, so I spent a lot of time in my room, just because I wanted to. So I would really analyze these spaces, and I would make just imaginary scenes between these negative spaces and the branches. When that tornado came through, that tree was gone. And I was you don't really appreciate something fully until it's gone. We all know that. But I've always resonated with negative space. I remember when I was teaching 8th grade ceramics, I had a student, and he was like, Mrs. Mello, he's like, I never looked at negative space, and I'm becoming obsessed with it. I see it everywhere. I'm like, isn't it amazing? Look there, look here. It's everywhere. Like just looking at the shapes that these things create. And he would come in and just tell me these stories and these things that he would notice. But once you start noticing something that is around us all the time, and you just start observing, it can get a little not only overwhelming, but in a good way, but it's really, really completely transforms how you view things. Composition alone, the arrangement of the color, line, textures, negative space is truly a beautiful thing. So with that being said, I used to make viewfinders for my students, and I would force them, if they wanted to, I would force them with paper, and they were square viewfinders. If you were here on opening night, I got an awesome email from someone who had sent me an image, and she was using, oh my gosh, you're phenomenal. I made a whole bunch of these little guys to and some people got it right away. Like it just transforms your way of looking at things. It really does. It forces a new perspective. And oftentimes it's like, oh my gosh, I did not even know this was here. So Kelsey I didn't want to say her name, she had sent me this amazing photograph in Crested Butte, and she was holding the viewfinder and had taken a picture, and I'm like, oh my gosh, these lines, these shapes. It's just an amazing perspective. So with that being said, that's kind of where my fascination with negative space came from. I used to show it to my students, and little do they know, I mean, their energy, middle school students' energy, they inspired me so much equally. And I was like, oh my gosh, I just would get fueled up. And like, yes, this is amazing. Look at this way of looking at things. And it's just gotten to this point where I wanted to make an exhibit based on something that people don't normally see. So that's where my windows concept had come from. And it is hard to tell, like I said, to see one thing without having something completely contrasting. So like the traditional windows that we see as artists, or that you see as collectors or viewers. So traditional versus non-traditional ways of looking at things. I wanted to be sure that I had that sort of balance. But I know we all settle as artists into our own traditional ways of creating, and it was kind of a risk to take this way of kind of viewing things differently, but also still instilling my style. But it was a fun challenge. And like I said earlier, I can't quite sit still anyway because I'm working with oil paint and caustic. I dabble in other things, crazy things with my kids even. So it's fun to see things differently and experiment, especially when they're side by side. Like, oh, look at what this does. Look at the impact that this now has. And honestly, I have my students to thank for a lot of that. And my middle school students, who are now, some of them are married and have kids, which is crazy to think about, but it's fun. It's fun. It's a whole new perspective. I have a book. I got another book of Turner for Christmas. This last Christmas, my husband got it for me. The way that he depicts atmosphere in itself is quite breathtaking, and the layers. I know this might sound weird, but this goes back to being a kinesthetic learner. I'm a very kinesthetic person. But if you can envision yourself, and with his paintings I do, that's why I'm going here, but if you can envision yourself, like what it might feel like, what the air might feel like on your skin, what it might smell like outside. If a painting of mine can do that, it's done like tenfold. That's an incredible feeling to know that it's impacted someone that way. So I guess to strive to be like Turner, oh gosh, I would only love to create that sense of atmosphere and that depth. So beautiful, beautiful paintings, but yeah. Oh, light. I there's not a chance. I can't shake. There's no way. I mean, the light, the yellows, the oranges, just the bursts. Like, how in the world is that sunlight created? And it is. And a lot of people will ask. And 5 years ago, I may have said, yes, I diligently look at my sketches that I've created for pieces. I don't. I don't. I do, but I obsess, and I probably drive my husband and some of my friends crazy because I will literally stare at something for a long time and try to figure out how in the world I could recreate this. How could I get the color? And I remember pulling my students to a window and saying, look at these car reflections, the lights off of the car. We didn't have a nice river to look at. So cars it was, looking at the reflection off the cars. I'm like, what light is there? And I do have this obsessive personality over shapes, over the sky. I think I scared a mutual friend of ours out of her skin the other day. We were out here, I had an ice cream, I looked at the sky, oh my gosh, stop. And I had to capture that moment. But it is one of those things that I think there's people that have to plan, and there's people that question how, and then they experiment with it in the artwork. it's interesting. Yeah. Part of me felt guilty, like, oh, I didn't have a plan. I just went in on this. But why? It's okay. It's okay to take a risk and see what happens. Does it fail? Absolutely. Of course it does. But how sweet it is when it works out the way you were trying to create it. So sometimes, yes, if it's me, like, stop doing what you always do, Shannon, try over here. Honestly, that's probably where it comes from. Like, try, and I look at, I think it's called, what is it called? The golden lace at the edges of clouds, I think it's called. So I'll look at that, and that's one of the things that I tend to add last, or just hints of it usually in my work. But it's funny, like I'll start with the main colors and I'll add those details after, but sometimes it shifts mid painting. But I do try to migrate my points of focus, because I do tend to get stuck in doing my habits. I love that you said suspenseful. South Haven, Michigan, Lake Michigan. That was it was a crazy storm, and it was I was a weird college student. I went to Western Michigan University, but I would go to the coast, and I would just fish. It was just me fishing, and all these like people walking around, and I just did my thing. I was happy as a clam doing that. Like it's so bizarre to look back and think about it now, but I remember observing that storm like, oh my gosh, I'm not leaving this place. I'm going to look at every movement, every cloud, everything. And yeah, yeah, it's those weird moments. And I can't explain it, like which moments, and sometimes they're like nothing big, nothing dramatic. But it's like, I must sit here and analyze this. So that was definitely one of them. And it was suspenseful, probably for the normal human beings. But that was pre-kid, so now it might be like, take over! No, I'm kidding. No, so, but yeah. But that goes with it. It's weird. It's that weird obsession, like, and I see it over and over, and I analyze, and I'll go home and I'll test it. Yeah, yeah. A lot of times since because at that time I didn't have a phone, and that was back in 2002. And but now I will take pictures quite often. Do I look at them? Not as often as I should. It's really odd. Like I take all these inspiring photographs, and I don't know why I don't use them as much as reference, but I do. It's interesting because I do look at reference photos, but not when I'm or literally doing the art. It's odd. I go in there and I go to town. It's interesting. So yeah, absolutely. Any other questions? Thank you, Gundy. All right.